The Forest of Echoes. One warm summer evening, the sky painted with shades of pink and orange, five friends decided to embark on an adventurous bike ride. Their town, small and surrounded by natural beauty, sat on the edge of a mysterious forest called the Forest of Echoes. This forest was infamous among the locals for its strange tales. People whispered about eerie sounds, disappearing travelers, and shadows that seemed alive. Yet, to the five friends, it was all nonsense. They were young, curious, and eager for excitement. The group consisted of Mark, the self-proclaimed leader who always acted brave, Eliza, the youngest and most cautious of the group, Sam, the joker who could lighten any mood, Mia, the observant one with a knack for noticing details, and Ben, the quiet but dependable friend. Together, they made a tight-knit crew, always seeking new ways to challenge their fears and explore the unknown. "Let's ride through the Forest of Echoes tonight," Mark announced confidently. "It's just a forest. All those stories are made up." Lisa hesitated. "Are you sure? My grandma always says the forest is dangerous. She's told me about people who went in and never came back." Sam chuckled. "Come on, Lisa. Your grandma also says not to whistle at night because it attracts ghosts." The group laughed, and even Lisa smiled nervously. As the sun dipped lower, they pedaled toward the edge of town where the forest began. The entrance to the Forest of Echoes was marked by towering trees with thick, twisting branches that seemed to form a natural archway. The air grew cooler as they approached, and the cheerful sounds of the town faded behind them. At first, the ride was enjoyable. The trail was smooth, and beams of golden light filtered through the canopy. Birds chirped, and the forest seemed alive in a pleasant way. But as they ventured deeper, the trees grew denser, their branches knitting together overhead and blocking out the sunlight. The air turned still, and an eerie silence replaced the cheerful sounds of nature. Lisa glanced around nervously. "It's so quiet now. Is it supposed to be this quiet?" "Relax," Mark replied. "It's just a forest." Forests are quiet at night. They continued pedaling, the crunch of their tires on the dirt trail the only sound. Suddenly, Lisa froze. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. "Hear what?" Sam asked, stopping his bike and looking around. "A whisper," Lisa said, her voice trembling. "It sounded like someone said my name." The others laughed, trying to shake off the tension. "It's just the wind," Mark said. "Don't let your imagination run wild." But as they moved further, the whispers grew louder. At first, it sounded like faint murmurs, but soon they could hear muffled voices. The voices were indistinct, but seemed to be calling their names. By now, even Mark looked uneasy. "All right, maybe we've gone far enough," he said, trying to sound casual. "Let's head back." The group turned their bikes around and started pedaling toward the direction they thought they'd come from. But something felt wrong. The trail looked different, twisting and turning in unfamiliar ways. Trees they were sure they'd passed before now seemed out of place. "I'm sure we came this way," Mark muttered, his confidence wavering. Mia frowned, her sharp eyes scanning their surroundings. "These trees look like they've been moving. Is that even possible?" Sam laughed nervously. "Trees don't move. You're just imagining things." The deeper they went, the stranger the forest became. The bike lights, which had been bright when they started, now flickered dimly. Shadows moved among the trees, but there was no sign of any animals or people. The air felt heavy, as though the forest itself was watching them. "This is getting creepy," Lisa whispered. Her hands gripped her handlebars tightly, her knuckles white. "We'll find the way out," Ben said softly, his calm voice offering a sliver of comfort. "We just need to stay together." As night fell, the whispers turned into chilling laughter. The sound echoed all around them, making it impossible to tell where it was coming from. Lisa let out a yelp as her bike hit a root and tipped over. The others rushed to help her up, but when they turned to look around, they noticed something horrifying. The trail behind them was gone. "It was right here," Mark said, his voice shaking. "Where did it go?" The laughter grew louder, and the shadows among the trees seemed to draw closer. Then, without warning, Lisa's bike light went out. When they turned to check on her, she was gone. Her bike lay abandoned on the trail, her helmet on the ground beside it. "Lisa!" Sam shouted, his voice echoing through the forest. There was no reply, only silence. Panic set in as the group frantically searched for her. They called her name, their voices cracking with fear, but there was no sign of her. Then, one by one, their bike lights began to flicker and die. "We need to keep moving," Ben said urgently. "We can't stay here." The remaining friends stuck close together, but the forest seemed to close in around them. The trees appeared taller and darker, their twisted branches like clawed hands reaching for the sky. The laughter grew more sinister, and faint footsteps could be heard behind them. "Who's there?" Mark shouted, spinning around. No one answered, but the footsteps didn't stop. Then Mia's light flickered and went out. In the dim glow of the others' lights, they saw her standing still, her face pale. Before anyone could react, she vanished into the shadows. Her bike clattered to the ground. Sam let out a shaky laugh, his usual humor replaced by fear. "This can't be real. It's some kind of nightmare, right?" Ben grabbed his arm. "Stay focused. We have to get out of here." The three remaining friends stumbled through the forest, their fear growing with every step. The laughter surrounded them now, blending with whispers and strange rustling sounds. Mark, who had been leading the group, suddenly stopped. "What is it?" Ben asked. Mark turned to them, his face pale and his eyes wide. "It's calling me. I can hear it." Before they could stop him, Mark dropped his bike and ran into the trees. Ben and Sam shouted after him, but he disappeared into the darkness. They were alone now, their bikes abandoned, as they clung to each other for support. "We have to keep going," Ben said firmly, though his voice trembled. "We'll find a way out." But the forest had other plans. The trail twisted endlessly, leading them in circles. Shadows moved closer, and the air grew colder. Sam's light flickered one last time before going out completely. He screamed as he was pulled into the darkness, his voice fading quickly. Ben was the last one left. He stumbled through the forest, his bike forgotten, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the shadows closing in, hear the whispers calling his name. Just when he thought he couldn't take another step, he saw a faint light ahead. Summoning all his strength, he ran toward it. The light grew brighter until suddenly he burst out of the forest and onto the edge of town. The warm glow of streetlights greeted him, and he collapsed to the ground, trembling and gasping for air. The forest behind him was silent, as though nothing had happened. By morning, Ben and Mark were the only ones who made it out of the forest of echoes. They were disheveled, covered in scratches, and too shaken to speak. To this day, neither of them will talk about what happened that night. The Forest of Echoes remains a place of mystery and fear, its dark secrets known only to those who dare to enter and survive. The ghostly cyclist Alex loved riding his bike. He wasn't the kind of person who liked to cycle in groups or take part in races. For Alex, cycling was all about freedom and discovery. He enjoyed finding new places, especially old and forgotten roads that seemed to lead nowhere. One cloudy afternoon, he decided to go for a long ride. The sky was gray, but it wasn't raining, so it felt perfect for an adventure. As he pedaled down a quiet country road, he noticed something unusual. On the left side of the road, hidden behind some bushes, was a narrow, overgrown path. It looked like no one had used it in years. Alex was curious. Where could it lead? He loved finding hidden places, so he decided to check it out. He pushed aside the branches and rode his bike onto the path. The path was bumpy and full of weeds, but Alex didn't mind. He loved the thrill of exploring. As he went further, the bushes cleared, and he saw something unexpected. In front of him was a small village. The houses were old and crumbling, and the streets were covered in cracks and dirt. It looked like no one had lived there for a very long time. The place felt too quiet. Alex got off his bike and started to walk around. The village was strange. The windows of the houses were broken, and the doors hung open. There were no signs of life. No birds, no animals, not even the sound of the wind. It was as if the village was frozen in time. Alex couldn't help but feel a little uneasy, but his curiosity pushed him to keep exploring. As he walked further into the village, something caught his eye. Leaning against a tree was an old bicycle. It looked dusty, but surprisingly well preserved. The tires were flat, but the frame was intact, and the paint, though faded, still had a bit of shine. It was strange. Who had left it there? And why was it in such good condition when everything else in the village was falling apart. Alex walked up to the bike and touched it. The metal was cold, colder than he expected. He felt a sudden chill run down his spine. It wasn't just the cold. It was the feeling that someone or something was watching him. He quickly turned around, but there was no one there. Just the empty village. Shrugging it off, Alex decided it was time to leave. The quietness of the place was starting to feel eerie, and the cloudy sky made it seem even darker. He got back on his bike and started pedaling back toward the path. But as soon as he did, he heard something. It was faint at first, but it became clearer. It was the sound of a bike bell. Alex stopped and looked around. The sound was coming from behind him, but he couldn't see anything. "Hello?" he called out, but there was no answer. Just the sound of the bell ringing softly in the distance. Feeling uneasy, Alex decided to ride faster. He didn't want to stick around to find out what was making that sound. As he pedaled down the path, he started to hear another noise. This time, it was the sound of tires crunching on gravel. It was faint at first, but it got louder. It sounded like someone was riding a bike behind him. Alex glanced back, but saw nothing. The path was empty. Still, the sound didn't stop. It seemed to follow him, growing louder with each turn of his pedals. Alex's heart began to race. He told himself it was just his imagination, but the sounds were too real. He pedaled faster, trying to outrun whatever it was. The crunching gravel and the occasional ring of the bell seemed to match his pace. No matter how fast he went, the sounds stayed close behind. Finally, he couldn't take it anymore. He stopped and turned around, ready to confront whatever was following him. For a moment, there was nothing. Just the quiet path and the overgrown bushes. But then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw it. A shadowy figure riding the old bike he had seen in the village. The figure was hard to make out, but its hollow eyes seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. It stared straight at Alex. Panic took over. Alex didn't wait to see what the figure would do. He jumped back on his bike and pedaled as fast as he could. The path was narrow and full of twists and turns, but he didn't care. All he wanted was to get away. The shadowy figure didn't make a sound, but Alex could feel it getting closer. He didn't dare look back again. The path seemed to stretch on forever, and Alex felt like he was losing strength. His legs burned, and his breath came in short gasps. Just when he thought he couldn't go any further, the path suddenly opened up into a clearing. But Alex's relief was short-lived. In his panic, he lost control of his bike and veered off the path. He crashed into a ditch and fell hard onto the ground. Dazed and in pain, Alex lay there for a moment, trying to catch his breath. When he finally looked up, the shadowy figure was gone. The path was quiet again. But then he noticed something that made his heart stop. The old bike from the village was lying right next to him. It was as if it had followed him all the way there, Terrified, Alex scrambled to his feet. He didn't even bother to check his own bike for damage. He just started running, leaving everything behind. Somehow, he found his way back to the main road. When he finally reached it, he collapsed in exhaustion. A passing car stopped, and the driver helped him. Alex didn't say much about what had happened. He just wanted to get as far away as possible. After that day, Alex never went back to that area. He told a few friends about his experience, but most of them didn't believe him. They said it was probably just his imagination or a trick of the light. But Alex knew what he had seen and heard. He knew the figure on the bike was real. Over time, Alex heard stories about the village. Some people said it had been abandoned many years ago after a terrible tragedy. Others claimed that a cyclist from the village had died on that old path, and that his ghost now haunted anyone who dared to enter. Whether the stories were true or not, Alex didn't care. He had no intention of ever finding out. Even now, Alex sometimes wakes up in the middle of the night, hearing the faint sound of a bike bell in his dreams. It's a sound he can never forget, a reminder of the day he came face to face with the ghostly cyclist. The Bridge of No Return, in a small, quiet town surrounded by rolling hills and dense forests, there stood an old wooden bridge known as the Bridge of No Return. It stretched across a slow-moving, murky river that reflected the gloomy skies above. The bridge had been there for as long as anyone could remember. It creaked with age, its wooden planks warped and weathered by time. The locals had a strange relationship with the bridge. They respected it, feared it, and most of all, avoided it at night. Stories about the bridge had been passed down for generations, whispered from parents to children, told around campfires, and shared at the local diner. The legend was simple. Anyone who crossed the bridge at night would never return. Some said it was cursed. Others believed it was haunted by spirits of the past. Whatever the truth was, one thing was certain: no one dared to test the legend. Well, almost no one. Jenna was a young woman who had recently moved to the town. She was an adventurous soul, someone who didn't scare easily. She had grown up in a big city where stories of ghosts and curses were nothing more than tales to entertain children. When she first heard about the Bridge of No Return, she couldn't help but laugh. It sounded like something out of a cheap horror movie. "It's just a bridge," she told her new friends at the local coffee shop. "Wood and nails can't hurt you." But her friends didn't share her skepticism. They exchanged uneasy glances and told her to take the stories seriously. "People have disappeared," one of them said, leaning in closer. "There was a boy from town who crossed it on a dare years ago. He was never seen again. And there was that hiker," another chimed in. "She went to take pictures of the bridge at sunset and vanished. They only found her camera. The last photo she took was a blurry image of something strange." Jenna rolled her eyes, but decided not to argue. She didn't want to offend her new friends, but deep down, she thought the stories were ridiculous. People don't just vanish because of a bridge. There had to be logical explanations for the disappearances. One foggy evening, Jenna decided to settle the matter for herself. She had just finished a long bike ride through the countryside and found herself near the infamous bridge. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and the fog was rolling in thick and heavy, muffling the sounds of the night. Most people would have turned back, but Jenna was curious. She wanted to see if the bridge was as eerie as everyone said. With her bike light cutting through the mist, she pedaled toward the bridge. The air grew colder as she approached, and an uneasy silence settled around her. Even the usual sounds of crickets and rustling leaves seemed to vanish. Jenna hesitated for a moment, her confidence wavering. But she shook off the feeling. "It's just a bridge," she reminded herself, pushing forward. As she reached the entrance, she noticed how old and fragile the bridge looked up close. The wooden planks were cracked, and the railings were covered in moss. Her bike light flickered, making the shadows dance. She took a deep breath and began to cross. The planks creaked under her tires, and the sound echoed in the stillness. Halfway across, she felt a sudden chill. It was as if the air itself had turned to ice. Then she heard it, faint footsteps behind her. Jenna stopped and turned around, expecting to see someone following her. But the bridge was empty. The fog swirled around her, thick and impenetrable. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling slightly. There was no reply. She shook her head and laughed nervously. "Get a grip, Jenna," she muttered. But as she started pedaling again, the footsteps returned. This time, they were louder, closer. She turned again, and her breath caught in her throat. Emerging from the mist was a figure, its shape barely visible. It moved slowly, almost gliding, and its features were obscured by the fog. "Who's there?" Jenna shouted, trying to sound brave. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it continued to approach, its presence growing more oppressive with each passing second. Jenna's heart raced. Panic set in, and she pedaled as fast as she could. But no matter how hard she pushed, the bridge seemed to stretch endlessly before her. The figure was still behind her, its pace unchanging yet relentless. The fog grew thicker, wrapping around her like a cold, damp blanket. Her bike light flickered again, and then went out completely, plunging her into darkness. She could barely see a few feet ahead of her. The sound of the footsteps was deafening now, echoing in her ears. She screamed, but the fog swallowed her cries. And then, silence. The next morning, Jenna's bike was found at the entrance to the bridge, but she was nowhere to be seen. The townspeople shook their heads sadly when they heard the news. "Another one?" they murmured. Over the years, more stories surfaced about the bridge. Some claimed to see Jenna's ghost wandering the bridge, her figure barely visible through the mist. Others heard her voice warning them to stay away. The legend of the Bridge of No Return grew stronger with each passing year. a chilling reminder of the dangers that lurked in the fog. The townsfolk continued to share the story, warning newcomers like Jenna to heed their advice. And while some laughed it off, others couldn't shake the feeling that there was something very wrong about that old wooden bridge. The truth about what happened to Jenna and all the others who disappeared remained a mystery, lost to the mist and the silence of the bridge of no return. The abandoned tunnel on the outskirts of a quiet little town, surrounded by hills and dense woods, a group of teenagers often gathered to look for something exciting to do. Life in the town was slow, and there weren't many places to hang out. So they spent their time exploring the woods, climbing hills, and seeking out hidden places that could spark some adventure. One sunny afternoon, 5 friends, Mia, Jake, Ellie, Sam, and Ryan, decided to venture further into the hills than they ever had before. The summer heat was making them restless, and they wanted to find somewhere cool to explore. "What about the old trails behind the quarry?" Jake suggested, adjusting his backpack. "Nobody's been back there for years. Who knows what we might find?" "Sounds good to me," Mia said, flipping her ponytail over her shoulder. Anything is better than sitting around in the heat. They grabbed their bikes, packed some snacks, and headed off. The trail was rocky and overgrown, but the group was used to biking through rough terrain. The trees became thicker as they climbed higher, and the town disappeared behind them. Eventually, they reached a clearing where the ground leveled out. "What's that over there?" Ellie said, pointing to a dark opening in the hillside. It was half hidden by vines and bushes, but it was clearly the entrance to something. The group parked their bikes and walked closer. The opening was wide and framed by crumbling bricks. Above it, a rusty metal sign hung crookedly. The words had faded, but they could still make out, "Old Railway Tunnel." "This must be part of that abandoned railway they talked about in history class," Sam said, peering into the tunnel. "It's been shut down for decades." "No way," Ryan said, grinning. "This is perfect. We have to check it out." The group hesitated for a moment. The tunnel's entrance was dark and unwelcoming, and a cool breeze flowed out, giving them goosebumps despite the warm afternoon. "Come on," Jake said, pulling out his flashlight. "What's the worst that could happen?" With that, they all grabbed their flashlights and stepped inside. The air inside the tunnel was cold and damp, making their skin prickle. Their voices echoed as they spoke, bouncing off the curved brick walls. Graffiti covered almost every surface, and the ground was littered with old cans and broken glass. "Looks like we're not the first ones to come here," Mia said, kicking a can aside. As they walked their bikes further into the tunnel, the light from the entrance grew dimmer until it disappeared completely. Now the only light came from their flashlights, which flickered slightly with every step. "This place is creepy," Ellie whispered, her voice trembling. "That's what makes it fun," Ryan said, but even he sounded less confident now. About halfway through the tunnel, they noticed strange markings on the walls. The symbols were drawn in dark, jagged lines, and they didn't look like the usual graffiti. Circles, triangles, and strange shapes intertwined with words in a language none of them recognized. "Looks like some kind of ritual stuff," Jake said, shining his flashlight on one of the symbols. "Maybe this was someone's idea of a joke." "It's not funny," Mia said, stepping back. "I don't like this." "Relax," Sam said. "It's probably just some bored kids messing around." But then a low growl echoed through the tunnel. It was deep and guttural, and it seemed to come from somewhere up ahead. The group froze, their flashlights shaking in their hands. "What was that?" Ellie whispered, clutching Mia's arm. "Probably just the wind," Ryan said, though his voice wavered. "That didn't sound like wind," Mia said, backing away. Before they could decide what to do, they noticed movement in the darkness. Shadows seemed to shift and swirl, forming shapes that didn't make sense. Suddenly, a tall figure emerged from the blackness. It was distorted, its body unnaturally long, and its face was hidden beneath a dark hood. The group screamed and turned to run, but something felt wrong. Their bikes, which had been easy to push moments ago, now felt impossibly heavy. It was as if an invisible force was holding them back. "Go!" Jake shouted, trying to move forward. One by one, their flashlights began to flicker and go out. The darkness closed in around them, swallowing their screams. The last thing they heard was the sound of the growl, louder and closer than before. The next morning, hikers found the group's bikes neatly lined up outside the tunnel's entrance, but there was no sign of the teenagers. Search parties combed the hills for weeks, but it was as if they had vanished into thin air. The town eventually sealed the tunnel with heavy iron gates, and warning signs were put up, urging people to stay away. Locals whispered stories about what might have happened, but no one knew the truth. Even now, on quiet nights, some say they can hear echoes of laughter and screams coming from the abandoned tunnel. But no one dares to go near it to find out. The ghostly race in a small, peaceful town surrounded by green hills and quiet forests. There was a special yearly event called the Midnight Race. This event was well loved by the townspeople. Every year, when the full moon lit up the sky, cyclists from all over would gather to compete. The race started in the center of town and went through winding roads, across fields, and deep into the countryside. Everyone thought it was thrilling to ride in the cool moonlit night, and the townsfolk would line the streets to cheer on the riders as they sped away. But there was something else about the midnight race, a spooky story that had been told for as long as anyone could remember. People said that a ghostly cyclist joined the race every year. This ghost was said to be a mysterious figure dressed in old-fashioned clothes, riding a bike from a time long gone. It would appear without warning, race alongside the riders for a while, and then disappear just as suddenly. Most people laughed at the story, thinking it was just a way to add excitement to the event. Others, however, weren't so sure. One year, a young man named Tom decided to take part in the midnight race. Tom was new to the town, having moved there only a few months earlier. He loved cycling and had heard about the race from his neighbors. They told him it was an amazing experience, but they also warned him about the ghostly cyclist. Tom, like many others, didn't believe in ghosts. He laughed it off, thinking it was just a silly legend meant to scare newcomers. On the night of the race, the town was buzzing with excitement. The streets were filled with people cheering, laughing, and wishing the cyclists good luck. Tom arrived at the starting line, feeling a mix of excitement and nerves. The full moon shone brightly in the clear sky, casting a magical glow over everything. The race began, and the cyclists sped off into the night. Tom quickly took the lead, his heart pounding with adrenaline as he pedaled harder and faster. The cool night air brushed against his face, and the sound of tires on the pavement filled his ears. He felt alive and free, confident that he could win. As the racers moved farther from the town, the crowd's cheers faded into silence. The road stretched ahead, dark and empty, with only the moonlight to guide them. Tom stayed focused, determined to keep his lead. After some time, he reached a long, lonely stretch of road surrounded by fields. It was eerily quiet, with no sound except for the rustling of leaves in the wind and the faint hum of his bike. Suddenly, Tom noticed something unusual. Another cyclist had appeared beside him. He hadn't heard anyone approach, which struck him as odd. He glanced over and was startled by what he saw. The cyclist was dressed in clothes that looked like they were from another time, an old, tattered jacket and a flat cap. The bike the rider was on was equally strange, with a rusty frame and thin, squeaky wheels. But what unsettled Tom the most was the rider's face. It was pale, almost lifeless, with hollow eyes that seemed to glow faintly in the moonlight. Tom's heart raced, but he told himself it was just another competitor trying to intimidate him. Determined not to be shaken, he pedaled harder, trying to pull ahead. But no matter how fast he went, the strange cyclist stayed right beside him. Then, in a voice that was barely more than a whisper, the rider said, "Turn back." Tom's skin crawled. The voice was cold and hollow, sending shivers down his spine. He tried to ignore it, convincing himself it was just his imagination. He focused on the road ahead, pushing himself even harder. But the rider stayed beside him, repeating the same words, "Turn back." The warning made Tom uneasy, but he refused to give up. He was determined to finish the race and prove to himself that he wasn't scared. As he neared a sharp bend in the road, the ghostly rider suddenly swerved in front of him. Startled, Tom tried to avoid a collision, but he lost control of his bike and crashed. The impact threw him to the ground, leaving him dazed and injured. As Tom lay there, struggling to catch his breath, he saw the ghostly rider standing over him. The figure's hollow eyes stared into his, and its voice hissed, "Leave this place." Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished into the darkness. Tom was left alone on the desolate road, too shaken to move. Hours later, Other racers found him lying there, muttering incoherently about the ghostly cyclist. They helped him back to town, but Tom was never the same after that night. He refused to talk about what had happened, and he never rode his bike again. The midnight race was canceled the following year. The townspeople said it was out of respect for Tom, but deep down, many believed it was because of the ghostly tale. The story of the ghostly cyclist became a part of the town's lore, passed down from generation to generation. Some said it was just a legend, while others swore it was real. Whatever the truth, the midnight race was never held again, and the ghostly figure remained a mystery, haunting the town's history forever.